365 CRM use case as well. So trying to. Okay, so yeah, big thanks to all the sponsors who made it happen, this event. So big thanks to Solgray and DCG, Docs42, Pack, and also ScriptRunner. So a big thanks. And also a big shout out to Ross, because when I joined the first London event, Ross encouraged me to speak in these events. So a big thanks, big shout out. So yeah, we're going to talk about Azure Function, Block Trigger, and Dynamics 365 use case. And it's a little bit about me. I work as a software engineer for Vanquis Bank in London, and views are my own. I have a blog. Recently, like last week, it's been it was the 10th anniversary of the blog, so I've been blogging for 10 years, and then also that's my LinkedIn and Twitter handle as well. So this session, just to give you an idea, like if you are on the technical side, if you're a developer or someone like that, then obviously it's it's a little bit technical as well. But even if you're on a functional side, it's still useful to understand that this scenario is possible and the solution is can be applicable. So C-Insure is a car insurance company in London, and they're using Dynamics 365 CRM sales module. So Mr. Tom Turmeric is a customer service agent who works for C-Insure. So Tom's main job is supporting the customers mainly. So he supports the customers, and also he does other things, like for instance, he does manually imports a payment transaction file into Dynamics CRM every day. And then also he's very helpful, so he helps his work colleagues as well. And then also he has to handle time pressure. Also, you could imagine situation like COVID, they have to handle a lot of stuff. He's a good problem solver as well. So like we all say on a Monday or Tuesday, it's been a long week. Storm does the same. And then this is the manual data import. So you guys might be familiar with the manual data import to Dynamics. It's a good feature, but sometimes it can cause errors, and you need to resolve these issues and stuff like that. Also, situation like a scenario like when you need to import a payment transaction file every day, then obviously unless someone is working over the weekend, it's quite hard, because obviously weekend payment transaction file will be delayed to process. Now, as you could see in the picture, Tom is not that happy. He's a bit overloaded with work, so too much work, and also a lot of human errors. So that caused tough days at work. I don't know why he's using a calculator here, but still, he's very busy. Now, Tom talks to the developer team of the C-Insure to see if they can help out on something, because he's already overloaded with a lot of stuff. So the developer team of C-Insure, they came up with a solution for the data import, and obviously they automated the payment transaction file import to Dynamics. So that's a happy ending, because obviously Tom is happy now, because he has more time to spend on the customer issues, like very specific customer issues and things like that. So obviously that's a good thing for Tom. So he's with full energy now, and also it's good for the C-Insure company as well. Now, you guys might be wondering, oh, how did it happen? Like, how did we made Tom happy? So the key thing is here, we have a kind of a CSV file in this instance. So, excuse me. So we have a CSV file. This is the payment transaction file. Obviously in this demo, I picked up a very simple example, simple CSV file. So this CSV file needs to be imported to Dynamics. So this goes under the contact record. So you have a contact in Dynamics. Under the contact, you have something called payment transaction record. So this is the mapping happens. So the CSV file, it goes to Dynamics payment transactions. Now, this is a high-level solution design of this solution. So basically, so the payment file, as you could see here, we have a third-party legacy system. It's a very old system. It doesn't have an API or any other way to communicate. It can produce a file, and then we need to process that file. So you can see that the payment transaction file is dropped every midnight, and then it dropped into a SFTP file server. And then there is a batch script in the SFTP file server, which copies this file to Azure. And it happens at 5 a.m. in the morning. So you could see here, this is midnight, and then later in the early morning, this file is copied from the SFTP server to Azure. Now, there is a command line option provided by Microsoft. It's called Azure AZ copy or Azure copy. And then obviously there are other ways as well. So some way to copy this file to Azure. Now, Azure Blob, we always say Azure Blob, but actually the structure is more like there is a storage account. Under the storage account, we have a storage container, and then under that, we have a blob. So that's even though we always say Azure Blob, this is the kind of structure it has. So the file that we copy from here, the payment transaction file, is becoming a blob. So it's actually copied to storage container, and that file is the blob in this scenario. So it could be multiple blobs, but in our case, it's just one blob, and it is inside the storage container. So the file is copied here, and then the Azure function is it's more like a trigger driven. So Azure function is always like, it has a trigger, and it will execute as soon as the trigger happens. So in this context, we have the trigger as the blob. So that means any time in this context, and as soon as the blob is copied to a storage container, the Azure function gets triggered. So that is the blob trigger. So Azure Functions, you heard a lot about, in today's sessions, and it's quite popular. But the thing is, as soon as you understand the use case scenarios of these Azure Functions, it'll give you more ideas. And also, when you see a business problem, you might be able to recommend a solution, saying, "Oh, you could use a blob trigger in this case, or it could be an HTTP trigger, other triggers as well." Now, the function got triggered. As soon as the function got triggered, it has the code to execute this, to process this file. And then obviously in our case, we are writing into dynamic CRM. So the web API, we are using CRM Web API option to write it into Dynamics. Now, I'm going to show you guys some links, because you guys don't need to write any notes, so I'm just sharing some links. So I'll be talking about that in a sec. So we are talking about CRUD operations, which is create, read, update, delete. So any of the operations are possible from Azure Function. In this context, we are using Web API. Now, the next part is obviously the CSV. So we talked about a CSV file, and that is the input for this whole thing. That's the payment transaction file. Now, in this demo, obviously, it's a very simple CSV file, but this file could be very complex as well, because in some cases, you could imagine it's a third-party system. So it's a legacy system. So it produces some file which may not even have a header, that kind of scenario. So regardless whatever the file is, it's important thing is to understand the structure, because once you get the structure, you would know what to, how to process that. So it's important to understand the structure. In this context, obviously, we have only reference, amount, transaction number, and payment date. So I just, classified them. So it's good to recognize what this data represents, and then obviously it's important to confirm the requirements with the business or whoever, from where you're getting the file, because otherwise the processing, you wouldn't know what to exactly process. So in this case, it's only simple one, but could be complex. Now, Azure Blob. So, like I said, it's so Azure Blob is, in simple words, it's an object storage solution. Now, it's mainly stores unstructured data. Now, that could be a bit complex to understand, but in simple words, it's like storage, like a file storage, that kind of thing, not like a SQL database where you have a structured data like different columns and string value, another one. This is more like a object storage, and it's more like unstructured. So simple solution, simple example is obviously the files. So as you can see here, this is a Microsoft screenshot. This I created this small one just to understand a bit more. So basically, you could see here account, they mean storage account actually, and then container, they mean storage container. And then blob is the, in our context, our blob is obviously the CSV file, but it could be other file types like image1 or, whichever other file type. So it's kind of object storage. So, but important thing is to understand the structure, storage account, storage container, and then blob. Blob is the actual kind of file in this context. Then obviously, so the security. So this was a news in December, actually, last year. So it caught my eyes because, it's talking about Azure Blob. So a business developer actually failed to follow the basic security practices for Microsoft Azure Blob Storage. Now, this is just, some kind of lack of knowledge and whatever it is, but in my point is it's important to consider the security when you build applications like this, especially Blob, Azure Blob, because this news, it was saying that and a lot of data was exposed to public. So that wasn't a good thing at all. And so we'll give you some tips for that as well. So the important thing is security is important. Consider it as an important factor when you develop or when you consider solutions, and also follow your security policies of your company and discuss with your security team if you have one. Consult with them just to make sure you're taking the right steps. Now, this is a Azure Blob sample. So, like I said, once you create the storage account, and under the storage account, you got the storage container, and then under the container, you got a blob. Now, this is a sample blob, which is demo.csv. Now, if you open the blob in Azure, you get the URL, something like this. So you could copy that URL and you could try it from your browser. When you try it from browser, you shouldn't be able to access it. That is the whole idea. So when you try to access from blob browser, you should at least say, oh, it should at least public access, not permitted, or it shouldn't be able to access in any of these ways. So we need to protect that. Even part of the URL, none of them shouldn't be accessible in any way. Instead, we will use some security way to copy files to Azure Blob, and also even if you need to read from that, you need to do it through proper security. So I'll mention that in the next bits. Now, one important setting in the is at the storage account level. So storage account, and then obviously the storage container, and then blob. On the storage account level, which is the highest level, there is a setting called allow public access. It's a very small setting, it's a tiny bit, but this is quite important one, because when you restrict at the storage account level, it also helps for the next levels as well. So this setting is quite important, even though it looks very small in my view. So when you create a storage account, by default, it is enabled actually. So that means if you don't change it, or if you don't review when you create the settings, it will be created as enabled. So that means public can access the storage account, which is really bad. So make sure that this setting is reviewed, and make sure that this is disabled. Then obviously, so now I talked about all the secure stuff. So we made it super secure. No one can access it. But then how do we actually write it into that? That's the next bit. So there is a secure way. Obviously, there could be other ways. This is the one I came across. Obviously, AZ copy command. So it's a command line utility to copy blobs to and from a storage account. Now, this is a free tool from Microsoft, obviously. So they're talking about two kind of security mechanism that you could write it into or read from the storage account. One is using Azure AD and the other one is using shared access signature. Now, in this context, obviously, I used the shared access signature and this is a very simple sample. So you could see here that copy option using SAS token. So even if you go to a simple command line utility that you have, like CMD that you have in your PC. So if you go to this folder is obviously can be downloaded from Microsoft. That's why I shared the link in the chat. You guys could see the first link is about AZ copy. So you could download it from there. And then once you extract that, you could go to just like a command line and then use this command to copy stuff to Azure Blob. So AZ copy, and copy is the command, obviously, and then source is the C demo.csv, whichever your source file is, and then target is here. Now, the part from SV equal to, this is the actual shared access key. So this is kind of a structure you could easily copy. So what we are trying to do is we have a file in a server or in your PC, whichever. You want to copy that to Azure, Azure Blob. Now, there is obviously batch file option. So obviously the first part was we tried it from a command line to see, whether this is copied correctly and, copying fine. The next step is to move that into a batch file, which is .bat file, because once you move to the batch file, you can easily use that in a scheduler or any other kind of scheduling option. So you can execute the batch file and that file will be copied straight away. Now, the difference is like the command line, you have the similar commands, but the one thing when I was trying this out, it was like the percentage should be replaced with the double percentage. Percentage is usually in the shared access key. So shared access key will be, with the fancy characters and stuff. So if it got a percentage sign, you need to replace that with a double percentage. Otherwise, it will not work. That's a simple thing. So batch file content, for instance, this is the batch file, simple, a very simple one, echo of no input. Echo of means no input. And then it's going to this directory and then it is doing the AZ copy command and then copying the file demo.csv from your local folder to Azure Blob. That's what it is doing, the batch file. Once you have the batch file, obviously the next bit you could do is you could use, in this context, obviously I use task scheduler, but if you have any better scheduler, you could use that as well. Excuse me. So a task scheduler. So in your PC, you could see if you type task scheduler, you could see simple task scheduler, which you can create a task and with an action and a trigger. So trigger is something like, when it should trigger. So it could be like every day, 5 o'clock in the morning, it should trigger. Like I said, Tom's file, it arrives at 12 a.m., so midnight. And then the next bit, the copying part is happening in the early morning. So that could be the trigger. And then action, what should happen when that triggers? So in this case, when that trigger happens at 5 o'clock, the file should be copied from the server to the Azure Blob so that Azure Function can process that. So yeah, in the screenshots, you could say create task and then it selected a batch file, that is the action. And then obviously the trigger, what time it should trigger and that kind of. Azure Function, obviously, even in today's conference, we were talking about Azure Functions. Everyone was talking about it. So, you guys, I believe you guys are familiar as well. So, it's basically a serverless solution. Now, the logo of the Azure Function is basically this part is a code, and then obviously this is a trigger. So that's why it has a code and trigger kind of a combination. That's why they got a logo something like this. Now, it's a function as a service. It's a serverless solution from Microsoft. I really love them. It's like Azure Functions are really cool. And even it's event driven and also scalable as well. So you could easily spin up something without any delay. And also if your skills are more in PowerShell or JavaScript, you could still write, or Python even, you could write a Azure function in that language. It doesn't have to be in C#. So whichever your preference, you could go with that, and then you create the Azure function in that. Now, like I mentioned briefly earlier, the Azure function, the triggers are the power. So even though there are a lot of triggers, we need to understand, business scenario and then find out what is suitable. So in this context, obviously, we picked up a blob trigger. So you can see here that it's saying a C# function. Obviously, this case I'm using C#. That's why C# function that will be run whenever a blob is added to a specific container. So that is the trigger. So as soon as the blob is copied to the container, it will trigger. Now, excuse me. So there are other triggers, like for instance, there is a queue trigger. So when something comes into the queue, and then the queue, that trigger the Azure function. So it's kind of, Azure function is kind of, it executes only when that trigger happens. Until that, it's kind of in a sleep mode. So it's not really using resources. It's not continuously kind of, taking a lot of resources. Now, other samples are obviously timer trigger, a C# function that will run on a specific schedule. So if you want to even use something to trigger every day at some point, you could use Azure. So it's all about understanding the trigger, and then when you get a business problem, or when you want to design a solution, you could utilize that trigger, and that's the way to go. Now, this is a very simple one, creating Azure function from Visual Studio. You could either create from Azure Portal or from a Visual Studio. So this is a sample from Visual Studio. Now, when you create the Azure function from Visual Studio, you get the options, like you get the option to say which version. So .NET Core is the latest one. So obviously, in this context, I selected .NET Core. It also supports .NET Framework as well. So it's up to you. And then good to have with the latest one. And then one other bit is a Dynamics 365 connectivity. If we go with the .NET Core, we need to go with the CRM Web API connectivity, because the organization service one will not be supporting this .NET Core. So that's another thing. Now, a blob trigger, yes. So here I selected the blob trigger, and then obviously I have two other bits to select here, which is the connection. This is the connection part, and then this is the path of the container. So it's the container name, and this is the connection of the blob. So these are the things you need to kind of select when you create the Azure function. Now, like I said, we made our storage account and other things very secure. So how do the Azure function read the blob? So they have to go to, this is the part. So it's the access keys under the storage account. So you get a connection string from here. That's how Azure function will read the blob. So if you go to storage account, access keys, and then you can see show keys, you will get a connection string. Using this connection string, you would be able to read the blob. This is the container name. So you have the storage account. Under the storage account, you have a storage container. You need that name for the Azure function to read. So this is a very sample Azure function. So if you could see here, this is a blob trigger. So this green bit is the trigger. Earlier, Gary's session, he was showing another HTTP trigger as well. So things like that. So it's just a different trigger in this context. And then this one is the container name. I have a container, that's container blob trigger demo. And then connection is, this is the name of my connection, but actually the connection is defined in a settings file. So when you deploy to Azure, a similar thing, you will have a settings option there. You will define your connection there. So that's the way to do. So yeah, so this is a very simple one, and then obviously when you deploy, it'll be similar. But it's important to understand what are the parameters that we need to container name and the connection. Now, so let's say we have an Azure function is ready to connect to Dynamics. Then the next bit is obviously we are thinking, okay, what are the ways to connect to Dynamics CRM? So the popular, we have two options: organization service, which is based on SOAP, and other one, and the endpoint is like that. And then also we have a kind of a new, obviously it's not that new, but still CRM Web API is there using REST API. So when you, I would recommend obviously CRM Web API option, because currently it looks like this is getting more popular and you could connect from .NET Core, so it's very good to have. Now this is the endpoint for that. Now this is the CRM Web API architecture, something I created to understand. So we have Azure AD domain services. Obviously, we were talking a lot in this today's conference, other people. So we have Azure AD domain services here, and we have a dynamic CRM here. Now, the important bit is that these two are under the same tenant in Azure. So both are under the same tenant, and then obviously we have some configurations we need to do in this in order to authenticate this. So under the Azure AD domain services, we have something called app registrations. So we need to create a new app registration. When you create a new app registration, you get an application ID, and also you could define API permissions for the Dynamics 365 under that. And then you could create a client secret. So in this context, I created using client secret, but obviously managed identity is also possible. But in this context, I went with the client secret. Now, these are like some configurations. So there is no coding at this point. It's just configurations. So the links I shared in the chat, you would see step-by-step instructions to. That's why I shared that. So you guys don't need to worry about the configurations part. You could, if you follow that, you could do it step by step. The configurations that needs to be done in the Azure AD. Now, once this is done, you need to get the application ID and go to Dynamics CRM, and then create an application user there, and use the, so it lasts, when you create an application user, it lasts for the application ID from the AAD. So you could provide the same ID that we got from here, and then using the, you could create the user and then apply some security roles. Then this user is kind of ready to go. Now, Azure Function, what it does is it'll request the bearer. In this context, I use client secret. So it'll get the bearer token using the application ID and client secret. And then bearer token is from the Azure AD. Using that, it'll go to Dynamics and it'll try the CRUD operations, which is create, read, update, and delete operations. So when it hits the Dynamics CRM, obviously it'll ask, oh, do you have a token? So if the Azure function doesn't have a token, then Dynamics is not going to allow to do anything. That's the end of the story. So it's always, it's a good way to protect this and make sure that only an application with the right bearer token can do the CRM Web API read or update or all those sort of operations. Step-by-step instructions, you could find it in the blog. And then, so you guys might be wondering, like, how does this bearer token looks like? So yeah, it is quite long, actually, 1,200. And I was also curious how long it is, how big it is. So 1,260. And then a token lifetime is like default is 1 hour. So obviously, if you have an application that takes more than 1 hour, you need to renew a new token and get that. Now, this is a very functional view. So what does the Azure function in our context? So it reads file content from the CSV file, the TOMS file, the CSV, payment transaction file. And it reads from the file, and then it maps to Dynamics CRM. So obviously, like I said, the CSV file just have some columns, and that needs to be mapped into Dynamics, which is more like a contact. Under the contact, you got a payment transaction records. So that is the kind of mapping it needs to do. And then obviously that's the writing part, which we said, like a CRUD operation. We need to write it into Dynamics. Then only the record will be created in Dynamics. Now, this is a technical sequence function, Azure function technical sequence. So when I created this, it was like I created like tiny services so that each service does only one thing, and also you could write unit tests and all those things easily. So for instance, there is a token service here. Token service, what it does is it'll just get a token from Azure AD. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything more. And also, if you hear a file reader service, what it does, it just reads the file. So that kind of small services, that way you could easily unit test them, and also you could get a better readability, and also coding makes much more easier. It doesn't have to do exactly same way. You could, logically you can group whichever you guys feel like, okay, I need to, group them this way, whichever way you prefer. This is one way to do. Dynamics 365's CRM API limits. Excuse me. So this is a very popular topic, but I thought it's good to share. So there are two types of API limits. So people always get confused with this, the limits, because there are two. That's the main reason. So one is more like a requests and allocations, and other one is called service protection limits. So requests and allocations are more like it doesn't have any system throttling. You could buy licenses, like something called API limit licenses, if you exceed the daily limits. So this is still Microsoft started evaluating this from October last year. It's not enforced yet, but it will soon in the future. So it's basically you might need to buy more licenses. So your system will behave as usual. There is no problem with that. It'll be fine, but it just involves a cost element. And also any things like any plugins or workflows, all those things are actually counted for this. So that is the request and allocation. So that is the one section. Other one is obviously service protection limits. Now this is more like it's like a 5 minutes window. So if you're doing a lot of API calls in 5 minutes, so if per user is like 6,000. So if you exceed that, obviously it will throw actual error. It's like too many requests error. So you need to have a retry mechanism in place. So that's why it's more important as well, because if you don't have that, obviously you wouldn't know that your API calls are failing, and it can go wrong. So plugin workflows are excluded for this one. So it's important to have a retry mechanism in place. Now, in the links I shared, one of them I explained about these API limits. So if you guys are interested further reading, you could I made it in a nutshell, and also the some tips for that's also shared in that link. So some tips for implementing the service protection API limits. So that's for the CRM Web API scenario. So Microsoft recommends this way. So more like when you do the HTTP client operations, like it should go through, they recommend to go through the send async. So even if you have a get operation or delete operation, all goes through send async operation, so that this goes all in one place, and your retry will be can be implemented in one place as well within this method, and then obviously that can communicate to Dynamics 365 CRM. So yeah, if you're interested, you could read that in my blog. I shared already the links. Now, a demo. So So I have a folder here, simple one, which is, I have a demo.csv file, which is very simple file, like I said, reference, amount, transaction number, payment date, that kind of data. Very simple Tom's file. And then I have a batch file here. Like I explained earlier, we have echo off, so we don't need any input in this case. We are going to this folder where I have the extract of the AZ copy. And then I'm executing a command AZ copy this file to my Azure Blob. So that's the batch file I have. And then I have in my task scheduler, so I have a task scheduler here. So you could see here that I have a very simple task test. I have a trigger which runs, once it's run, it repeats every 2 minutes. So I made it that way because, we can see the results quickly. So it runs every 2 minutes. And then action, what should I do? When it triggers, it will execute the batch file we just explained. So the batch file will be executed. That means it'll copy the file to Azure Blob. Now I'm saying OK to this, and then I'm enabling because I made it disabled. So in the worst case, we can run it either, run as well. Now, the other part is obviously we have the Azure Function. So Azure Function is here. So Azure Function, I'm keeping it running, so that when the task scheduler runs, it will actually execute this. So I'm keeping it running. And then on the dynamic side, we have a very simple model-driven app, which is Azure Blob Trigger Demo. And in the model-driven app, I have some contacts. That's very simple one. For each contact, I have some transactions. Yeah, so this is something I was playing around. So like you could, so this is the window it's executing already. So the task scheduler, it executes every 2 minutes, and that means you should see something here. So let me see, newest. So the Azure function, let me check. So yeah, Azure function is hit here. So you see because the task scheduler ran, and then Azure function hit because that copied a file to Azure Blob. So as soon as the blob, so you could see that it's triggered, and then blob length was 192. So it'll trigger again in another 2 minutes because it's always, I kept the scheduler running, so it'll hit each time. Now each time, what will happen is here. It'll create a new record. So I'm just waiting for the next run so that you guys can see that it's triggered. And then as soon as that happens, you would see a new file, a new transaction file under this one. So that is the kind of thing happening. Now, I haven't deployed this to Azure portal yet because this is locally running. Obviously, in the Azure function, I mean, even if we deploy that to Azure portal, that the same thing will happen. As soon as something arrives in the blob, it'll say new blob detected, and this is the blob name as well. So you could see that this is the blob trigger here. So this is the way we identify, okay, this is a function, and then obviously this function is a blob triggered function. And then also, so then you could see the blob detected here. So that means the scheduler ran, and it actually copied a file, it detected that, and then it executed the function. And when it executed the function, within the function, we have something logging. We are logging the size of the file. So that's the blob length, and then it executes. So it succeeded. So if there is failure, so now you could see that this is actually executing the next 2 minutes run. So as soon as this happens, you would see another trigger here. Now this is done. So could not find. Let me see if. Yeah, so yeah, this must be the demo god thing again, like we were talking earlier. So it looks like it's stuck for some reason. Yeah, so I can actually execute this from the from here. So I'm just gonna run this. So you could see that it's running now. It's run. Now you would see another the function will the trigger will have, yeah, so you could see another copying very soon. hopefully, yeah, you could see here two. There are two actually. So in Dynamics, if I refresh, that's the thing we want to see. So you could see that it's a 331. There was another one created today. So this is the new transaction logged. So if I open this one, it's basically linking to that contact and showing this amount. So that very simple one, but the key idea is that this transaction was created from the CSV. Now, Azure Functionist, oh, this was the error actually. So some error happened. That's why. Sorry about that. It's just, like I said, it's a demo code thing. It was running fine. Just stopping this. So the key idea is that, you have Azure Function here. So simple one, Azure Function, it's a blob triggered function, and then it processed all the, the CSV file. Like I said, we have different services, token services. What it does, it just gets the token for that. And we have other services like file reader service. It just gets it just reads the file. Different services, and then it's still running. I have to stop. So all these things, and we have a different model. So, like I said, payment transaction is the model we have in Dynamics. So this is the CRM Web API. So we have, these are the attributes in the CRM Web API. And this is the transaction row. It's a very simple CSV file model. So we have reference, amount, transaction number, and payment date. These are the stuff. But and this is mapped to the payment transaction in Dynamics, and then that's how the records are created. So let me go back to the resources. So yeah, so like I said, these are the I have shared some resources, so you guys can easily, if you guys want to play around later, feel free to, because this is the, these are the resources. So you would see step-by-step instructions here. For instance, if I click on this one, let's see. So this is the CRM Web API with Azure Function. So I just created a very simple Azure Function and explained how to do this. So each step you could see, all the screenshots and stuff. So you could create a simple Azure Function to authenticate with the CRM Web API. And then also talked about the AZ copy, API limit, and also set up Azure Function with blob trigger. Also automate the file copy. So if I click on this one, this is the one I was explaining. We have the file copy part. So how to set it up. So you go to Azure storage, create a new storage account, and I'll show this way. So screens will be. So you create a new storage account, and that's the deployment part. So very simple one. The important setting I mentioned earlier, this is the disable the public, allow public access. And then in the storage account, like I said, we have a container under the storage account. So we create a new container. When you create the container, it would always say, okay, the public access level is to private because it's disabled. So this is why I was saying that it's always helpful, even in the things under the storage account as well, not just storage account. So that setting is quite important. It helps a lot for the to make sure that it's not accessible for a public. And then this is a container. You could either upload here a blob, or obviously in our case we are automating that. So to get the shared access signature. So in the presentation I mentioned that the authentication we use to actually copy file to Azure Blob using AZ copy. We use a shared access signature. So there are two options, either AD, Azure AD, or shared access signature. So this is the one, this is the way to create. So if you go to storage account and shared access signature, you could create a new shared access key, which will have all these attributes. So I would always say, like, select only the one you need. So if you want only write permissions, so in this context, as you could see, I just need to write a CSV file to container. That is the only thing I need to do. I don't need to delete it. I don't need to, do any other operation. So select only the services you need, and also expiry part, actually, like whichever the date you prefer. And then other thing is obviously, so this is the sample for shared access signature. And then obviously you could utilize that, the copying part like I explained earlier. So this is a demo.csv file in the container once it's copied. And then obviously that triggers the Azure function. When you try to access, public access is not permitted. So you should get that. And then this is the other part. So everything is explained here. So you guys can refer later if you guys are interested. And when you guys have similar business problem, business solution that you need to design, you could refer that. And once again, big thanks to all the sponsors and also, for making it happen, this event. Yeah, it is a big thing, to share knowledge, and that's the way we grow. And I'm happy to refer any questions if you guys have. And also, here is my links. I already shared that in the chat.
Awesome, Diaz. So Diaz, there are a few questions actually, believe it or not. There's quite a lot of people are interested. This pattern,
Sure.
I believe, is a common pattern that a lot of people are looking to implement. And I think Cochrane's first question was, any clue on when Microsoft could start enforcing the API limits? So that's one of those questions. I don't want to put you on the spot, Diaz, but I'm happy to mention that this is something that Microsoft have started to enforce. Now, how they enforce it is a different question, and because there's a lot of things happening under the hood there. But in basically, in short, this year is the year you can expect all those API limits to be enforced. In fact, the API limits have been enforced now. We have to comply to those API limits. So that's, in short, that's the answer, really. I mean, how they enforce it is a completely different thing altogether, right?
Yeah. So I have again, just to add to what you said, Ras. So basically, my understanding is that the sales team of Microsoft, they are analyzing, the API limits that we are doing. So each tenant, we have a lot of API calls. They are doing some analysis already, and then only they will come back. That's my understanding. Again, my view. And I was trying to understand these two limits, like I said earlier. So that's why I summarized them to like a nutshell view. Like you have request limits and allocation, and this is the daily limit we are talking about. And yeah, so if you guys refer this link, you have two links. One is specific for the request allocation, another one is for the service protection. The request limit per allocation is based on your license. So if you have a 365 enterprise application license, your limit will be like 20,000 per day. But if you have professional one, obviously you have less, so those kind of things. So if you guys are interested, this is a good one to read to understand a bit more.
Fantastic. Next question is Evangelist saying, sorry, yes, I may have misunderstood. Do you mean that if you have webhooks in D365 calling Azure functions, those calls do not add up to those API limits counter?
Sorry, I didn't get the question, sorry.
So if you have webhooks in D365 calling Azure functions, those are not included in the API limit count.
I don't know that one actually. Yeah, I mean, I have used the webhook, the one we configure from the plugin registration tool, right? So we configure it, and then as soon as an action, something happens, a trigger happens, it will send a webhook to Azure function. But I don't know whether that is counted towards the API limit. I don't know that part, sorry. But I can try to investigate a bit more. Maybe Ras might know. Ras, do you know this one?
Good question. Yeah, I don't want to give an answer because I could be wrong. I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. It's a bit selfish one.
But yeah, it's definitely a good scenario that we need to get some clarity on there regarding where those counts. In fact, I think we do need a whole session on API limits and licensing. To be honest,
yeah,
we do
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the way to reduce the API limits as well, right? So that becomes like a big session. If there are what can we do to reduce? Obviously there are different ways, but then so.
So Daniel's saying, as your function log natively to application insights, can you see all the logs there if you enable it?
all the logs. We also log them. So yeah, we enable the app insights. So most of the stuff will be logged, but then we need custom logging as well. So let's say you're doing an operation within Azure Function. It's good to log, okay, you're doing this operation and it couldn't find some value, that kind of. So it's kind of combination, not just enabling it. We also need to do some custom logging, in my view.
So Zafar's asking, can you please show where you have been calling the CRM CRUD operations in the Azure function?
Oh yeah, sure. Sure. Definitely. Not a problem. So you guys can see the screen still, right? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. So, like I said, we have different, I separated them to different services. So we have a CRM Web API service. That's what we are calling the CRM Web API. Now, so this one, I have a simple one here, like who am I? So that's just to get the who am I. So this is one of the endpoints. And obviously the endpoint is defined in the configuration. So if I go to configuration, just to show you guys the, so this is the kind of root URL, and then under the root URL you have, plus the URL you have a who am I. So that's the kind of simple one, and this is the create payment transaction. So there is a function here to create a payment transaction. Now, this list is actually the one we converted from the CSV file. So we come here with the CSV content as a list with the list of payment transaction, and then we are doing a post async operation here to post it into Dynamics. And like I said, this is post. So you have the new payment transaction. This is the entity name in Dynamics, and this is the URL. So you're posting to that. Now, if I go inside this method, this is the one I was talking about. You have a post async, but also I have another internal call, something called send async. So send async is more like a generic method where you could implement the retry mechanism. So my retry is here, the one Microsoft recommended. This is for the service protection API limit, not for the request allocation. Service protection API is if you exceed the limit in 5 minutes, that kind of implementation. So that's the way I did within the send async. So each time you get a post async here, and then from there it'll call the send async. If I have any other get async or any other one, it will also go to the send async. So send async is a kind of common call to Dynamics. In here, you could see that I'm doing HTTP send async. So this is the actual call to Dynamics. And obviously you have a request because this is a CRM Web API. So you have a request there, it'll do a send async. This will post it in Dynamics. And then as soon as that happens, you would see that under the contact record getting created.
Fantastic. Okay, so what's next? We have any other questions here? So Cochrane's saying there was a great session about API limits covered by Scott Durrow.
Cool.
Yeah. So API. Okay. So I think there's a lot of questions on API limits, and obviously I don't want to dive. Oh, right. CDS Saturday. Right. Okay. Yeah. We did an event last year, CDS Saturday. We've got another event coming up, Power Platform Developer Bootcamp, which is basically the similar concept to the CDS Saturday that we did last year, which will be covering the similar things really. So guys, what we will do then is all the questions related to API limits, which I know there's lots of questions on, guys. We're going to cover them in the upcoming Power Apps Developer Bootcamp, right? That's in May. Yep. Power Apps Developer Bootcamp is in May. So make sure you're registered for that. That'll be covering all the deep dives around how to develop for Power Apps and Power Platform. And we will be covering all your issues around API limits. So yeah, but anyway, going back to the topic now, this pattern that you've used here, Dias, it's a great pattern. I mean, I used it myself for data cleansing operations, data merging and cleansing operations inside of Dynamics. So it is a cool, but what you've done is taking it further there. So that's really, really good. So there's lots of great feedback and a lot of interest in this pattern that you've described here, Dias. It is a pattern that you can use for many different use cases, so it's great to see what you've done there. And you've really, I like that you've decoupled a lot of the processes and to incorporate better unit tests. So that's really nice to see that, Dias. So yeah, so lots of great feedback, Dias. Lots of people, lots of great feedback from this session here today. I think what's this done really is open a can further. So we talked about automation this month. We've talked a lot about the tooling available in the platform for Power Automate for Azure, and we also covered in the previous weeks on UI test automation. And it's opened up another can. We're going deeper now, and so it's set the scene for going deeper. And so I personally believe that the Power Apps Developer Bootcamp, which is going to be 3 weeks, is going to be 3 weeks throughout the month of May. It's going to begin on the 15th of May, which will be focused on Power Apps in particular. The week after, the 22nd, it'll be focused on PCF development. And then the last week will be Power Platform development, overall architecture. So, so that's that. So again, big thank you to Dias. Dias, could you please remember to share your contact details, your blog? I'm sure many people would want to follow up with you on your blog. Also follow up, please share your connection details as well. Please also leave that screen open because it's come at a very good time. So whilst you share your contact details, Dias, we are about to announce the winners of the prizes.